The parking lot of a closed supermarket at 3 in the morning is one of the loneliest places on earth. No movement, no sound except the low hiss of rain against asphalt and the occasional click of a traffic light changing colors for nobody. The fluorescent lights above the entrance hummed and flickered, casting a pale yellow glow across rows of empty shopping carts chained together near the entrance, their metal frames beaded with rainwater. In the far corner of the lot, away from the lights, sat a dark blue SUV with a cracked rear bumper and a left tail light held in place with electrical tape. The engine was off. The windows were fogged from the inside. Sarah Calloway had been sitting in the driver's seat for 2 hours without moving. She was 34 years old, but she had stopped feeling 34 somewhere around the fourth week of sleeping in this car. Her hands rested in her lap, still deliberate, the way hands rest when their owner is too exhausted to do anything but breathe. Her dark hair was pulled back tight. Her uniform shirt from the coffee shop still carried the smell of steamed milk and ground espresso. She had come straight from her second job, the office cleaning shift that ran from 10 at night until 2 in the morning, and she had driven here because she had nowhere else to go. In the back seat, her 3 daughters slept. Nadia, 12 years old, sat upright against the window with her arms folded across her chest and her chin tucked down, the way she always slept when she was trying not to take up too much space. Even unconscious, she was careful. Even in sleep, she was already learning to make herself smaller for the world. Petra, 10, had stretched sideways across the middle seat with one arm dangling off the edge, her math textbook wedged under her head as a pillow. She had fallen asleep doing homework. Sarah had watched it happen in the rearview mirror, the pencil going slower, the eyelids dropping, the head listing sideways until the book stopped her fall. June was 7. She was curled in the far corner of the back seat with her knees pulled to her chest and her small face tucked against the seat cushion, one hand still gripping a crayon she had been using before exhaustion took her. The crayon was yellow, the color of kitchens and houses where children wake up warm. Sarah looked at them in the mirror for a long time. She held a piece of paper in her lap. She had been holding it since before she parked. The letterhead read, Millbrook County Housing Authority, and the words at the top of the page read, Notice of Eviction, Final, and below that her name and an address that no longer belonged to her and a date that had passed 4 weeks ago. She had folded it and unfolded it so many times the creases had gone soft. She set it on the dashboard without looking at it anymore. Outside, a plastic bag tumbled slowly across the empty parking lot, pushed by the wind, catching the yellow light for a moment before disappearing into the dark. Sarah watched it go. This was not the first night in the car. It was not even the worst. The worst had been a Tuesday 3 weeks ago, when June had woken up crying from a nightmare, and Sarah had held her across the center console and told her they were on a special camping trip. Just the 4 of them. An adventure. And June had almost believed it. Almost. Sarah was good at the almost. Before all of this, before Marcus left, before the business collapsed, before the gambling debts surfaced one by one like bodies rising to the top of a lake. Sarah had been a registered nurse at Millbrook General. A good one. She had the kind of steadiness under pressure that other nurses noticed and patients remembered. She gave difficult news without flinching and held hands through the hard parts and stayed late when staying late mattered. She had given it up willingly. That was the part that still snagged on something inside her when she let herself think about it. She had given it up willingly when Marcus's contracting business started bringing in real money, and they decided together that someone should be home with the girls. She had surrendered her career with her eyes open, believing that the life they were building was solid, that the man beside her was what he appeared to be. Her nursing license had lapsed during the 14 months she spent at home. The cost to recertify was more than she could save in 6 months at her current wages, assuming she had somewhere to live, assuming she wasn't sitting in a parking lot at 3 in the morning listening to her youngest daughter breathe. Marcus had been gone for 2 years now. He had left on a Wednesday morning while the girls were at school. No note, no call. The bank accounts came next, and then the creditors, and then the paper trail of debts he had built in both their names using money she hadn't known about from card games she hadn't known he played. The divorce was finalized in his absence. The judge signed the papers in a courtroom where Sarah sat alone on one side and nobody sat on the other. She had held it together through all of it. She was very good at holding things together. 4 weeks ago, she had stood in the doorway of the house she had raised her daughters in with a cardboard box of June's drawings in her arms and watched a moving company take back the furniture that turned out to have been bought on credit she had never agreed to. Nadia had stood very still with her arms at her sides. Petra had cried quietly and tried to hide it. June had not fully understood what was happening, which was somehow the hardest thing of all. Since then, 4 weeks of sofas and air mattresses and one long weekend in this car when there were no sofas left to ask for. The neighbor who had taken them in most recently, a kind woman named Helen who worked double shifts at the hospital and had 2 kids of her own, had sent a text 2 nights ago that Sarah had read so many times she had memorized it. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I need my space back by Friday. I'm so sorry." Friday was 3 days away. Sarah reached into her apron pocket and took out a folded piece of newspaper. Not the eviction notice. Something else. Something a customer had left behind on a table by the window during the morning rush, forgotten under a coffee cup. She had almost thrown it away with the rest of the trash. She unfolded it carefully. It was a classified ad, small and set in plain type, barely larger than a business card, positioned in the lower corner of the page as if even the newspaper hadn't thought much of it. House for sale. $1. Cash only. 1619 Birchwood Avenue. Must see to believe. She had read it 6 times already. She read it again now. $1 house. The phrase sounded like something from a bad joke or a worse dream. Houses did not cost $1. People did not sell homes for the price of a stick of gum. There was a catch, and the catch was probably catastrophic. Condemned, infested, toxic, structurally unsound in ways that could kill a family in their sleep. But she folded the paper back along its creases and put it in her apron pocket. Because she had 3 daughters asleep in the back seat and $78 and some change left in her checking account in 4 days until Friday. And desperation, she had learned, makes dreamers of the most practical people. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass and held it there until the cold moved from the glass into her hand and from her hand up her arm and settled somewhere just below her collarbone, where it belonged. Then she closed her eyes and did not sleep so much as stop being awake, the way you stop being awake when sleep is the only remaining option and your body finally takes it whether you give permission or not. She sat there until the rain slowed. Then she lay back in the driver's seat and looked at the ceiling of the car and thought about the classified ad in her pocket and what it would mean to walk into a building and sign papers for a house and have an address again. A real address, the kind you write on school enrollment forms, the kind that means your children wake up in the same place 2 mornings in a row. Outside, Millbrook was beginning the slow work of becoming morning. The sky stayed dark but changed quality, denser, more intentional. Somewhere across the parking lot, a sparrow started up and then stopped, as if reconsidering. Sarah Calloway looked at her daughters one more time in the rearview mirror. Then she made herself a promise that she had no business making and every intention of keeping. This is not our forever. I will build us something new. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't confidence. It was the thing that comes before both of those. The decision to try, made in the dark, when you have run out of reasons to believe it will work and have discovered that you're going to do it anyway. She sat there until the candles of a nearby diner flickered on and the first delivery truck of the morning pulled into the lot and the day officially, irrevocably began. Then she closed her eyes and slept for 2 hours with her hand still in her apron pocket, folded around a piece of newspaper that cost nothing and might cost everything. She went to look at it the next afternoon, after school pickup, all 4 of them walking because the gas gauge was sitting on the wrong side of empty and she needed to save what was left for emergencies. 14 blocks. Nadia walked beside her without complaining. Petra walked on Sarah's other side and counted the blocks under her breath, which was how Petra processed anything, by making it into numbers. June held Sarah's hand and looked at everything with the open, cataloging attention of a child who has recently learned that the world can change without warning and has decided to study it more carefully from now on. The streets changed as they walked. The storefronts gave way to older houses, then to older houses with plywood on the windows, then to a block where every third property sat behind a tangle of dead grass and chain-link fence. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous. It was just finished. It had the particular stillness of a place where everything had already happened and nothing new was being planned. 1619 Birchwood Avenue sat at the far end of the block like a monument to what time and abandonment could do to something that had once been genuinely beautiful. It was a Victorian, built sometime in the 1890s based on the bones of it, high gabled roofline, wraparound porch, decorative wooden trim along the eaves that must have been something to see a century ago. Now the paint came off in long, curling strips that lay on the porch like shed skin. One corner of the porch roof had pulled away from the wall and sagged at an angle, held up by nothing Sarah could identify. Every window on the ground floor was either cracked across or covered with boards that had warped and split in the weather. The yard was a tangle of overgrowth, dried Queen Anne's lace and ragweed, and something thorned that had consumed the front gate entirely. A rusted for sale sign dangled from a single chain post at the edge of the sidewalk, turning slowly in the October wind. Petra looked at it for a long moment and said quietly that it would take a lot of numbers to fix. June pressed close to Sarah's side and looked up at the dark windows and the hanging porch roof and the strip paint and said, in the particular way that 7-year-olds sometimes describe things with more accuracy than they intend, "Mommy, it looks like it's crying." Sarah stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house and felt something inside her chest that she couldn't quite name. Not hope, not quite. Something earlier than hope. The small movement of consideration that happens before hope. When something broken catches your eye and you haven't yet decided whether to look away. It needs someone to pay attention to it, she said, which wasn't really an answer, but it was what she had. The man who came out of the house next door moved slowly, with a cane made of dark wood that had been used long enough to develop a shine at the handle. He was somewhere past 70, dressed neatly in a wool coat despite the cold, with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who planned each step before taking it. His name was Earl Watkins. He had lived on Birchwood Avenue for 31 years, he said, and he had watched the house at 1619 go through 3 different owners and 2 decades of city maintenance disputes before the county finally stopped trying to sell it the conventional way. The last owner, a woman named Eleanor Greer, who had inherited the property from her father Frank, had died 2 years ago with no will and no heirs. The property had reverted to the city. The city had been mowing the lawn and paying the insurance and filing the liability paperwork ever since, and they were tired of it. "The foundation is solid," Earl said, looking at the house with the appraising eye of someone who had watched buildings come and go for a long time. "It was built on bedrock. That's why it's still standing. You can do a lot of damage to a house, and it'll survive if the foundation holds." He looked at the 3 girls, at Petra counting the windows, at June, who had released Sarah's hand and was now crouched at the edge of the sidewalk examining a beetle making its way across the concrete with complete absorption. "Foundation's solid," Earl said again, quieter this time. "This house has stood 130 years, longer than any problem you're running from." He looked at Sarah directly then, and in his eyes was the particular understanding of an old man who had seen enough human difficulty to recognize it without being told. "City Hall closes at 5, he said. "I used to work in the assessor's office before I retired. Come on, I'll walk you through the process." Sarah looked at the house, at the sagging porch and the covered windows and the yard that had swallowed the front gate. She looked at Nadia, who was looking back at her with an expression that said nothing but missed nothing. She looked at June, who had straightened up from the beetle and was now looking at the house with her head tilted, the way she looked at things she was trying to draw, measuring it, finding its shape beneath the damage. Sarah took the newspaper ad out of her pocket and unfolded it one more time. $1. Cash only. Must see to believe. "All right," she said. The transaction at City Hall took 2 hours and had the surreal quality of something happening in a dream where the rules of ordinary life have been quietly suspended. The clerk who processed the paperwork was a heavy-set man in his 50s who handled the documents with the particular boredom of someone who had been shuffling paper for 20 years and intended to shuffle it for 20 more. He found the file, verified the property status, confirmed the assessed value, $1, and produced a transfer deed with the casual efficiency of someone processing a parking ticket. He smirked when Sarah signed. "Congratulations on your mansion," he said. "Hope you've got good insurance." Sarah did not respond to this. She had learned over the past 4 weeks that some things were not worth spending energy on, and a clerk's smirk was near the bottom of the list of things that could actually hurt her. She signed where Earl pointed. She initialed where she was told to initial. She handed over a single dollar bill, one of the 78 remaining in her account, and received in exchange a deed of ownership and a key on a plain metal ring. The key was old, heavy. It had been cut from solid brass sometime in the last century and had the satisfying weight of something built to last. Sarah walked out of City Hall with $77 and a house. That first night was a lesson in the distance between ownership and shelter. They had no electricity. The utility accounts had been closed after Eleanor Greer's death, and reopening them would take 3 to 5 business days and a deposit Sarah couldn't produce. They had no running water. The pipes had been shut off at the main. The furnace was present in the same way that a museum exhibit of a furnace is present. It existed, it had once been functional, and it was currently neither of those things. Sarah bought candles and a battery-powered camping lantern from the drugstore 3 blocks over, using $12 of the 77. She found a camping stove in the back of her car and used it to heat water she brought in jugs from the gas station up the street. She spread their sleeping bags on the living room floor, in the center of the room, away from the walls where she could hear mice moving in the insulation. The roof leaked in 7 places. She counted them as they revealed themselves, drips forming in the ceiling plaster, then streams, then thin waterfalls that threaded down the walls and spread across the warped hardwood floors in dark ribbons. She placed every pot and pan she owned under the worst of them and spent an hour repositioning them as the rain shifted. The candles made the peeling wallpaper look like faces. June stood in the middle of the living room in her pajamas, looking at the dancing shadows with wide eyes and said, "Are we pioneers now, Mommy?" "Something like that, baby," Sarah said. She was pressing a towel against a gap in the window frame where cold air was coming through steady as a blade. The pioneers slept in places like this all the time. Did the pioneers' roofs leak? The pioneers had much worse problems than leaky roofs. June considered this with the gravity of someone taking new information seriously. "Okay," she said finally, and went to unroll her sleeping bag with the focused determination of a pioneer doing what needed to be done. Nadia had been quiet all day, that particular quiet that Sarah had learned to read over 12 years, the one that wasn't absence of feeling, but the opposite, too much feeling, being held very carefully behind a controlled exterior. She helped set up the sleeping area without being asked, organized the girls' bags, made sure Petra had her asthma inhaler within reach on top of her backpack before she settled in. She did all of it efficiently and without complaint. Then, after June was settled and Petra was doing a last pass through her homework by lantern light, Nadia came to stand beside Sarah at the window. Outside, rain blurred the street light into a smear of orange. The yard was invisible in the dark. "What if we can't fix it?" Nadia said. Not accusatory, just honest. The way she asked math questions, measuring the actual size of the problem, no larger and no smaller. Sarah looked at her daughter's face in the lantern light, 12 years old, and the shadows under her eyes that had no business being there at 12. "Then we'll live with broken things until we can," Sarah said. "But we'll live here, together, in our own home." Nadia looked at the room, the dripping ceiling and the dancing candle shadows, and the sleeping bags on the floor, and said nothing for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone who has decided to accept a difficult truth because rejecting it doesn't help. She went to her sleeping bag. Later, after all 3 girls were asleep, Sarah sat alone by the front window with her knees pulled to her chest and watched the rain. The house settled around her in the particular way old houses settle, with sounds that had their own vocabulary, creaks and contractions, and the soft percussion of water, finding its way through places it had been finding its way through for decades. She thought about the nursing license sitting expired in a folder in her bag. She thought about what it would cost to recertify and how long it would take and what she would live on in the meantime. She thought about Marcus, and then she stopped thinking about Marcus, because thinking about Marcus was a resource she had learned to budget with the same discipline she applied to everything else. She thought about the clerk's smirk. "Congratulations on your mansion." Something shifted in her chest. Not rage, she couldn't afford rage, but something adjacent to it. Something that had the same heat but burned steadier and longer. The heat of someone who has been underestimated one too many times and has decided, quietly and without announcement, to remember the feeling and use it later. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass. "This is not our forever," she said quietly, to the house, to herself, to the three sleeping shapes behind her. "I will build us something new." It wasn't bravado, it wasn't confidence. It was the thing that comes before both of those. The decision to try, made in the dark, when you have run out of reasons to believe it will work and have discovered that you're going to do it anyway. She lay down on her sleeping bag between June and Nadia, pulled her coat over herself, and closed her eyes. The daylight version of the house was harder in some ways and easier in others. In daylight, every problem was visible and specific and could be written on a list. The kitchen faucet produced water the color of rust that smelled of iron and old pipes. The bathroom toilet had cracked along the base and listed to one side like a boat taking on water. The stairs groaned under every step in a way that suggested structural concerns Sarah didn't yet have the vocabulary to categorize. The basement door, when she finally opened it and looked down, revealed a dirt floor gone soft with moisture and stone walls dark with decades of water seepage. She closed the basement door. She made a list instead. 4 pages, front and back, organized by urgency and rough estimated cost. She didn't know the actual cost of most of it, but she had learned that writing things down made them finite, turned them from an overwhelming cloud of bad into a series of specific problems, each of which had a specific solution, even if she couldn't see the solution yet. She enrolled the girls in the neighborhood school, a brick building 6 blocks away that smelled of institutional floor wax, an old cafeteria grease, and the particular energy of several hundred children compressed into one building. She filled out the paperwork at the front office, listed the Birchwood Avenue address as their permanent residence, and watched Nadia and Petra and June disappear through separate doors into separate hallways. Then she called Daniel Beckett. Daniel was technically her second cousin's ex-husband's brother, which is the kind of family connection that only exists in small communities where everyone is related to everyone else through enough marriages and generations that the web becomes unnavigable. What mattered was that he was a licensed plumber, that he owed Sarah a favor from the time she had driven 90 minutes each way for 3 consecutive weekends to sit with his mother through a difficult surgery and recovery, and that when she told him about the house, he said he'd come look without asking too many preliminary questions. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been doing physical work since childhood, which they had. He had served in the Marine Corps for 8 years before coming home and learning the trade, and he carried the particular stillness of someone who has been in situations where panic is not an option and has internalized that lesson so completely it has become his resting state. He spent 45 minutes in the crawl space under the house and another 20 in the basement and came up with dirt on his knees and a look on his face that Sarah had learned to recognize from her nursing years. The expression of a professional delivering news they know the patient doesn't want to hear. "The pipes are original to the house," he said, "or close enough to it. Lead service line from the street. Galvanized iron inside, which means rust, which is what you're seeing in the water. The whole system needs to come out." "How much?" It wasn't a question. It was a request for a number to write on her list. 8,000, Daniel said, minimum. And that's me doing the labor at cost. $8,000. Sarah thanked him and walked him to the door. She stood on the sagging porch and watched his truck pull away from the curb. Then she went back inside and sat down on the kitchen floor, the actual floor, back against the cabinet, knees up, and cried. She gave herself 20 minutes. She had learned that giving herself a time limit was more effective than telling herself not to cry at all. 20 minutes. She cried steadily and without restraint for exactly 20 minutes. And then she wiped her face with the hem of her uniform shirt and stood up and picked up her pen. She wrote plumbing, $8,000 on her list. She underlined it. Then she moved on to the next item. This was, she was learning, what survival looked like in practice. Not courage in the dramatic sense, not the kind that makes speeches and moves mountains. The smaller kind. The kind that gets up off the kitchen floor and picks up the pen. What followed was 3 weeks of the hardest work Sarah had done in her adult life. She kept both jobs. The coffee shop from 5 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, steaming milk and memorizing orders and managing the particular social complexity of a service environment where being too tired was itself a professional failing. The office cleaning from 10 at night until 2 in the morning, moving through empty corridors with a mop and a cart, erasing the evidence of other people's workdays. The hours between the house, she taught herself from YouTube videos played on her phone with the volume low so she wouldn't wake the girls. She learned to patch drywall, the proper way, with mesh tape and compound applied in layers, each one feathered out wider than the last. She learned to pull rotten wood from the porch floor and sister in new boards alongside the damaged joists. She learned to identify which electrical outlets were safe to use and which were connected to wiring old enough to be a fire hazard and needed to be taped off and marked. The girls helped after school. Nadia pulled nails from salvaged lumber with a claw hammer and the focused precision she brought to everything. Petra sorted hardware, screws and brackets in wire nuts organized by size in old jam jars, while simultaneously working through algebra problems she had set up on the floor beside her, her inhaler clipped to the front pocket of her jacket within easy reach. June painted. Wherever Sarah said it was safe to paint, June painted, first with the careful brushstrokes of a child trying to do it correctly, then with the broad, confident sweeps of someone who had discovered she was good at this. They got electricity working in 2 rooms, the living room and the room the girls shared, after Sarah spent an afternoon with an electrical diagram and a voltage tester and made every decision 3 times before acting on any of them. They got the water heater functioning after Daniel came back and installed a used unit Sarah had found at a salvage yard for $40, accepting in exchange a month of home-cooked dinners delivered in containers to his shop across town. The house was not warm. The house was not quiet. The house made sounds at night that Sarah was still in the process of cataloging and categorizing, the particular creak of each stair, the way the furnace, even non-functional, expanded and contracted in the cold, with sounds like someone moving slowly through the walls. The drip of the remaining roof leaks into the pots she moved to new positions as she patched the ones she'd already addressed. But it was theirs. That was the thing that kept returning to her in the quiet moments. Not as comfort exactly, but as fact. An irreducible fact that nothing could undo, not the leaks or the rust or the cold or the dark. The deed in her folder said Sarah Calloway, and that meant this broken, beautiful, impossible house was hers, and she had never in her adult life understood until now how much difference one word on one piece of paper could make. 3 weeks into November, the smell started. It was Petra who noticed first. On a Tuesday evening during dinner, cereal and toast, which was what dinner looked like on weeks when overtime hadn't come through. She wrinkled her nose in the particular way she wrinkled her nose when something didn't add up, and said, "Mom, something died down there." Sarah had noticed it too. She had been noticing it for several days, trying to classify it. Old house smell, rodent problem, burst pipes somewhere in the walls. But it was none of those things. It was something more organic than that, something that suggested not decay of materials, but decay of something that had once been alive. And it was getting worse, not better, and it was strongest near the basement door. She had been avoiding the basement. There was always something more urgent, more solvable, more within the range of what she could currently afford to address. But winter was coming in hard, and whatever was down there was not going to improve on its own. She waited until the girls were asleep. She took her phone for the flashlight. She bought a dust mask at the hardware store for $1.29. The cheap kind, paper and elastic, more psychological than protective. She found the crowbar she had bought at a yard sale early in the renovation, because a crowbar, she had discovered, was useful for nearly everything. She opened the basement door. The smell hit her before she was 3 steps down, thick and complex and wrong, with an organic sweetness underneath that made the back of her throat close. She kept going. The stone walls were dark and wet. The dirt floor was soft under her feet, spongy in the corners where the water collected. The beam of her phone light swept across old wooden shelving, a rusted hot water tank that had been removed and left leaning against the wall, the remains of some kind of wooden workbench collapsed under its own weight. She followed the smell to the far corner. She swept the light along the wall, looking for a gap in the stone where an animal might have gotten in and not gotten out. The stone was old, original to the house, cut and set in the 1890s with thick mortar that had darkened and hardened over a century into something closer to rock than paste. Except one section. Her light stopped moving. One section of the wall, maybe 4 feet wide and running from the floor to about shoulder height, looked different. The stones were the same size, same shape, same rough-cut limestone, but the mortar between them was a different color, lighter. Not the dark century-old material of the rest of the wall, but something applied 30, maybe 40 years ago. Recent in the language of old houses. New work, trying to look like old work, and not quite succeeding if you knew what to look for. Sarah ran her fingers along the mortar lines. The smell was strongest here. Behind this section, behind this newer wall. She stood in the coal basement for a long time, her phone light steady on the lighter-colored mortar, and thought about what kinds of stories end with someone repointing a section of basement wall and a smell that doesn't go away. She had watched enough news in her adult life to know the general shape of those stories. But she also had 3 daughters sleeping upstairs in a house that needed to be livable before February, and whatever was behind this wall was making the air in the basement unbreathable, and she could not afford to not know. She set the crowbar into the gap between 2 stones where the mortar looked thinnest. She pressed. The first stone came out easily, almost too easily, as if it had been set loosely on purpose, as if someone had wanted to be able to get back in. The smell rushed out in a wave that drove her back 2 steps, hand over her mask, eyes watering. But underneath the organic rot was something else, something metallic and cold and sharp that cut through even the heavier smell and registered in the back of her brain as significant in a way she couldn't yet name. She loosened 2 more stones. She shone her light through the gap, and the world she had understood until that moment rearranged itself into something entirely new. Behind the wall was a room, a small space maybe 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep, carved directly from the limestone bedrock. And filling that space, stacked from the dirt floor to the low stone ceiling, were metal containers, green, military style, with latched lids and stenciled markings she couldn't read from this distance. 30, maybe 40 of them. Several had tipped over and broken open, and what had spilled across the floor caught her phone light and threw it back at her in a dozen directions. Gold. Not jewelry, not coins. Raw gold. Bars and nuggets and dust, scattered across the dirt floor like a painting of impossible wealth. Sarah did not move for a long time. Then she made herself look at the corner of the room, the far corner, where the smell was heaviest, where something lay that was not metal and was not stone. A canvas bag rotted almost to nothing. Beside it, what fabric and leather remained of clothing long since given up to the damp. And there, unmistakable even in the weak beam of her phone light, unmistakable to someone who had spent years in a hospital and knew what she was looking at, the pale, curved shape of bone, and locked around what had once been a wrist, a pair of handcuffs, iron, rusted through in places but still closed, still holding together decades after everything else had come apart. Sarah stood in the basement of her dollar house with the smell of the past pressing against her from all sides, and understood that she had not simply bought a house. She had bought a crime. She did not sleep that night. After she replaced the stones, pushing them back into the gap with careful hands, pressing the loosened mortar flat, making the wall look as undisturbed as she could manage in the dark, she climbed the basement stairs and closed the door behind her and sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. The house settled around her, the drip of the last roof leak into its pot, the mice in the walls, the sound of Petra's slight wheeze from the room upstairs, the one that appeared sometimes in cold weather, the sound that meant she would reach for her inhaler in the night and manage it herself without waking anyone, because that was how Petra handled everything, quietly, efficiently, with no fuss. Sarah sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall across from her and thought. She had learned over 34 years of being Sarah Calloway that the distance between feeling something and deciding what to do about it was the only distance that mattered. You could not always control the feeling. You could always control the distance. What she felt, sitting at that kitchen table at 4 in the morning, was fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of sudden danger, the slower kind. The kind that settles in behind the sternum and stays there radiating quietly because you have understood something that cannot be ununderstood. Someone had died in her basement. Someone had been put there, placed there, locked in restraints and sealed behind a rebuilt wall, by someone else who had lived in this house and walked these floors and sat at this table. The house she had paid $1 for was not just a neglected property. It was a crime scene that had been sealed and forgotten and handed down through a family and eventually abandoned to the city and sold to her for the price of a candy bar. And behind that wall, alongside the bones of a man who deserved better than an unmarked grave in someone's foundation, sat more gold than Sarah had seen in her entire life. She got up and made coffee with the camp stove and the water jug and sat back down. Then she began to think practically. The Millbrook Public Library opened at 9. Sarah was there at 9:15. The girls dispatched to school. Her coffee shop shift rearranged to an afternoon start. She found a computer terminal in the back corner, away from the front desk, and sat down and began to search. She started with the house, property records, ownership history, tax filings. The chain was clear enough. 1619 Birchwood Avenue had been owned by one family, the Greers, from 1962 until Eleanor Greer's death 2 years ago. Frank Greer had purchased the property in 1962. Frank Greer had died in 1995. Eleanor, his daughter, had lived in the house for the remaining 27 years of her life, never married, no children, until she too was gone and the property passed to the city with no one left to claim it. She searched Frank Greer next. The results took a moment to load. Then they came. The first article was from the Denver Post, October 1987. The headline read, "Gold Shipment Stolen in Highway Robbery, Security Guard Missing." Sarah read it twice. A transport truck carrying approximately 200 pounds of raw gold from a Cascade mining processing facility outside Denver had been intercepted on a rural highway on the evening of October 14, 1987. The driver had been found tied to a guardrail, unharmed, with no memory of the period between leaving the facility and waking up beside the road. The gold, valued at the time at approximately $4 million, worth considerably more at current prices, was gone. And one member of the security detail assigned to the shipment, a man named Raymond Cole, 27 years old, had not been found. Raymond Cole, husband, father of a 2-year-old daughter. The article quoted his wife. "Raymond would never abandon us. Something terrible has happened. I know it. He would never leave his little girl." Sarah sat very still. She searched further. More articles spanning from 1987 through the early 1990s. The FBI had investigated. They had developed a list of persons of interest that included several current and former employees of the transport company that had contracted the security detail. One name appeared in 3 separate articles, always with careful, legally precise language. Person of interest, declined to comment, could not be reached. Frank Greer, resident of Millbrook, former logistics coordinator with the transport company, had called in sick the day of the robbery. Had retired from the company 6 months later, at the age of 41, for reasons that were officially listed as personal, but that neighbors and coworkers apparently found puzzling, given that he had shown no signs of financial security before and seemed considerably more comfortable after. The investigation had gone cold in 1993. No arrests, no recovered gold. Raymond Cole officially listed as a missing person, presumed dead. Frank Greer had died of a heart attack in his kitchen in June of 1995. His daughter Eleanor had found him. A neighbor interviewed for the local paper's small obituary notice mentioned that Frank had seemed troubled in his later years, reclusive, prone to long silences, reluctant to have visitors. The neighbor had attributed it to grief over his wife's earlier passing. Sarah thought about what grief over a wife's passing looked like, and what guilt over a man buried in your basement looked like, and how easy it might be to confuse one for the other if you didn't know what you were seeing. She looked at a photograph of Frank Greer reproduced in one of the articles. A town council meeting from 1988, Greer seated in the back row. He was a broad-faced man in his early 40s, heavy-set, with the look of someone who had once been physically powerful and was beginning to soften. His posture was tense. His grip on the back of the chair in front of him was tight enough that Sarah could see the knuckles even in the poor reproduction of the newspaper photo. Not a relaxed man, a man waiting for something. She found one more article before she closed the browser. 1995 from the local Millbrook paper. A brief follow-up on the Cascade mining case prompted by Frank Greer's death, noting that with Greer gone, the FBI's primary remaining person of interest had been removed from the equation. and the case would formally remain open but inactive. Accompanying the article was a photograph Sarah hadn't seen before. Raymond Cole, in his security uniform, smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of a 27-year-old who believes the future is something that happens to other people's plans, not his own. He had a daughter who was 2 years old when he disappeared. That daughter was now in her late 30s or early 40s. She had grown up without knowing what had happened to her father. Her mother had spent years insisting that Raymond would never have left willingly. And she had been right, in the way that people who know someone well are sometimes right about the thing everyone else refuses to believe. Sarah closed the browser. She sat in the back corner of the Millbrook Public Library and looked at the far wall for a long moment. Then she got up, returned the chair to the table precisely where she had found it, and walked out into the November morning. She did not call the police. She had thought about it, had turned the question over and examined it from every angle during the walk from the library back to Birchwood Avenue. She understood what the correct answer was. The bones in her basement were evidence in an open federal case. The gold was stolen property that had belonged to a company and a family and a man who had died for it. The correct thing, the legally required thing, the morally unambiguous thing, was to call the FBI field office in Hartford and report what she had found. She understood all of this. She also had $77 and a nursing license that had been expired for 2 years and 3 daughters whose address for the past 4 weeks had been a cracked parking lot in a city that did not have enough emergency housing for the families who needed it. She sat on the edge of the bathtub in the upstairs bathroom, the one with the cracked toilet and the faucet that still ran brown, and held her phone and thought about what happened to people who reported stolen property worth $50 million. The gold went back to its owners. There might be a small finder's reward, might, after months of legal proceedings and bureaucratic processing and means testing. In the meantime, nothing changed. $77 remained $77. Friday remained Friday. She was not a bad person. She wanted to be very clear with herself about that, even here. Even in the privacy of her own reasoning, she was a person in an impossible situation, doing the mathematics of survival with the numbers she had been given. She made a decision in 2 parts. The first part, she would not touch the gold yet. She would photograph it, document it, and think carefully about what came next. The second part was not negotiable, and it did not take long to arrive at. Raymond Cole deserved better than the corner of a basement in a house that had been sold for $1. His family had spent 37 years not knowing. Whatever else Sarah did or did not do, she would not let that continue. She drove to a library in the next county, 40 minutes each way, on a tank of gas she could not spare, and used a public computer to type an anonymous letter addressed to the FBI field office in Hartford. She described the location of the remains with precise detail. She included photographs she had taken on her phone, printed at a drugstore on the way, and sealed the envelope, wearing rubber gloves she had bought for the purpose. She mailed it from a post office in a town she had never been to and would not return to. Raymond Cole's family would have answers. The gold was a different question, one she was not done asking herself. The first sale happened 3 weeks later. She had selected the smallest piece she could find, a nugget roughly the size of a large marble, taken from among the spilled contents of a broken container, unlikely to be missed in any future inventory. She drove to a coin and precious metals shop in a town 40 miles from Millbrook on a Saturday morning while the girls were at Earl Watkins's house next door helping him rake the yard, which had become a Saturday habit that Earl pretended was his idea and Sarah pretended to believe. Her story was simple and memorized. Her grandmother had kept old jewelry in a lockbox. Sarah had been sorting through the estate. She wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. The shop owner was a thin man with the careful eyes of someone who had been deceived before and had restructured his entire professional life around not being deceived again. He examined the piece under a loupe for a long time without speaking. He ran a testing solution across the surface and watched the result. He weighed it on a digital scale with a display facing the customer. Then he looked up. "This isn't jewelry gold," he said. "This is raw, high purity, 93, 94%. You don't get this from melting down rings." He looked at her steadily. "Where did you say your grandmother got this?" "I honestly don't know," Sarah said. "She kept things. She didn't explain them." The man looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the nugget. "I can give you $780, he said. Sarah did not react. She had prepared herself not to react. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think about it." She drove home without selling it. The shop owner's suspicion had been too visible, too easily remembered. She needed a different approach, something more distributed, more patient, more invisible. What she built over the following weeks was methodical and careful and designed for invisibility. A different shop, a different city, every 6 to 8 weeks. Never the same place twice. Never within 30 miles of the last transaction. Always the same cover story, delivered the same way, in the same measured tone. Small pieces only. Nothing that would prompt a report or a second look or a phone call to anyone. The money came in slowly, but it came. Christmas arrived, and with it a change in the house that Sarah noticed before she could name it. The living room had a tree, a small one, bought from the lot on Merchant Street on Christmas Eve when the prices dropped, decorated with construction paper chains that June had made over the course of a week, and lights on a single extension cord that Nadia had run with careful attention to the electrical diagrams Sarah had taped to the inside of the fuse box door. Daniel Beckett arrived Christmas Eve with a box of gifts for each of the girls, which he claimed to have assembled from various sources, including, he said, significant input from a hardware store, because he was a man who expressed affection through practical items and saw no reason to apologize for it. Nadia received a proper set of woodworking chisels. Petra received a scientific calculator of the kind that cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. June received a set of professional watercolor paints and 3 brushes with handles made of real wood. After the girls had gone to bed, Daniel sat with Sarah at the kitchen table, the table they had found on the curb on a Tuesday, carried home between the two of them, and sanded and refinished over 3 evenings, and drank coffee and talked about the house and the work remaining and the spring and what spring might make possible. Before he left, he took something from his coat pocket and set it on the table between them. It was a compass, brass, old, the kind carried by a man in uniform, the glass slightly foxed at the edges, the needle moving with the slight wobble of age before settling. The case was engraved on the back with initials Sarah couldn't quite read in the kitchen light. "My grandfather carried this in the Pacific," Daniel said. "Brought it home. Said it never failed him. Not once in 4 years, through everything." He turned the compass once in his large hand. "Thought you might need something like that. Something that always knows which direction is home." Sarah picked it up. The needle swung and then stilled, pointing its fixed and unalterable direction. "A good compass always finds true north," Daniel said, "even when we choose to walk another direction." Sarah looked at the needle for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she closed her hand around the compass and thanked him. She began wearing it on a chain around her neck the next morning. She told herself it was because the chain was pretty. She knew it was because she needed the reminder, a daily physical reminder pressing against her sternum, that she had not yet entirely lost her sense of where north was. The letter arrived on a Thursday in January, plain white envelope, no return address. Her name and the Birchwood Avenue address written on the front in generic block letters, the kind produced by a printer set to the most common font at the most common size, anonymous by design. Inside, a single sheet of paper. On it, printed in the same careful anonymity, were 2 things. The first was a photocopy of a newspaper article. The Denver Post, October 1987. Gold shipment stolen in highway robbery. Security guard missing. The second was a sentence. "I know what you found." No signature, no demand, no threat beyond the threat it already contained in the knowledge itself. Sarah read it twice standing at the kitchen counter. Then she folded it and the envelope and carried them to the stove and turned on the burner and held them over the flame until they caught and burned down to ash in the kitchen sink, which she rinsed clean. She stood at the sink for a moment with the water running. Then she turned it off and dried her hands and went to pick up Petra from math club. She did not know who had sent the letter. She built the list of possibilities methodically, the way she built all lists, organized, prioritized, examined from every angle. Agent Harlow from the FBI, who might have been quietly investigating since the anonymous tip. Earl Watkins, who had seen more than he let on from his window next door. The coin shop owner in the town 40 miles away, who had measured her too carefully and offered her too precise a price. The jeweler in Hartford she had used once for a larger transaction and whose casual suggestion of alternative payment arrangements had sent her driving home with sweat on her hands. Any of them. All of them. Someone else entirely. She installed motion sensor lights on the front and back of the house that weekend. She checked the window locks every night before bed. She began varying her route to work. She said nothing to anyone, and the silence of it accumulated inside her like water behind a dam. Present, pressurized, patient. The furnace failed on a Wednesday in February during the coldest week of the year. The repair estimate from the HVAC company was $3,240, parts and labor. Sarah had been carefully rebuilding her cash reserves, money hidden in locations throughout the house that she rotated and updated the way she had read that careful people did, and the repair would consume the majority of what she had accumulated. It was manageable, barely, but manageable. Daniel came to help coordinate the repair company because he knew the owner and could get the scheduling moved up. And because that was the kind of help he offered without being asked, the practical kind, the kind that solved the immediate problem. While they waited for the technician, he sat across from Sarah at the kitchen table and said what he said in the way that Daniel Beckett said things, directly, without softening, but without cruelty either. Where is it coming from, Sarah? Not a question. A statement with a question's patience behind it. I've been putting in extra hours, she said. The coffee shop, some freelance work. The math doesn't work. He said it quietly. I'm not judging you. I'm not asking because I think you owe me an explanation. I'm asking because I'm worried about you, and I've been worried about you for 2 months, and I think something is wrong. Something in Sarah's chest tightened, not because he was wrong, because he was right, and because the rightness of it, spoken aloud at her kitchen table by someone who was looking at her with genuine concern and no agenda, was harder to receive than she had expected. I'm handling it, she said. I can see that. I'm asking how. The silence between them grew until it had weight. I don't need your worry, Sarah said. She heard the coldness in her own voice and could not stop it. It came from somewhere older than the conversation, from a place where she had learned that accepting help meant being visible, and being visible meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable was something she could not afford. And I don't need your charity. I appreciate everything you've done for this house, for the girls, I do, but I'm handling my own situation. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he stood and picked up his coat from the back of the chair. Caring about someone means telling the truth to them, he said, even when it's hard. He put the coat on. Whatever you're involved in, Sarah, I hope it's worth losing the people who are trying to help you. He left without looking back. The house was very quiet after he left. The girls were at school. The furnace technician wasn't due for another hour. Sarah sat at the table in the cold kitchen and looked at the compass lying on the counter where she had set it while cooking breakfast. The needle pointed north. It always pointed north. That was the entire point of it. And sitting alone in a cold kitchen that belonged to her in a house she had bought for $1, Sarah understood for the first time how it was possible to know exactly where north was and still choose to walk in another direction. The sedan appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. Sarah was pushing a cart through the parking lot of the Millbrook supermarket, loading bags into the back of the SUV, the same parking lot where she had sat at 3 in the morning 4 months ago with $78 and a piece of newspaper. The irony of the location was not lost on her. The sedan was dark, neutral-colored with no markings. It moved slowly along the row of parked cars and pulled up alongside her with the deliberateness of a vehicle whose driver knew exactly where they were going and had planned the approach. The window went down. Agent Harlow was younger than Sarah had expected, mid-40s, with cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and the particular quality of stillness that Sarah had come to recognize as belonging to people who spent their professional lives reading other people. She wore a plain jacket and looked like someone's accountant or insurance agent, which Sarah suspected was entirely intentional. We should talk, Mrs. Calloway, Harlow said. Her voice was level and unhurried. Not here, not today, but soon. She held out a business card through the window, standard FBI issue on the front, and on the back, in handwritten ink, a cell phone number. Call that number when you're ready. Sarah took the card. Harlow's window went up. The sedan moved on down the row and turned at the end and was gone. Sarah stood beside her loaded card in the February cold for a moment, the card between her fingers, and thought about the word when, not if. Agent Harlow had said, when you're ready, and the confidence in that word was its own kind of message. The message of someone who already knew the shape of the conversation and was simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same understanding. She drove home and put away the groceries and waited until Petra and June were in bed and Nadia was doing homework at the kitchen table. Then she drove to the storage unit she had rented under a name adjacent to but not identical to her own in the next county and began moving containers. She worked methodically, the way she did everything, planning each step before executing, minimizing trips, maximizing what each trip could carry. The containers were heavy, 30 to 50 pounds each, and she had to carry them up a shallow ramp, across the parking lot, and into her car. Years of nursing had given her more functional strength than her appearance suggested. She worked for 2 hours in the February cold, loading and driving and unloading at the cabin she had purchased through a sequence of financial steps she had constructed carefully over 3 months. A shell company registered in a state she had never visited, a real estate broker who specialized in distressed properties and moved quickly and asked few questions. She was on her way back from the third trip when she glanced at the clock on the dashboard and saw that it was 4 in the morning. She pulled into the driveway on Birchwood Avenue and turned off the engine and sat in the sudden quiet. The kitchen light was on. Nadia was at the table, fully dressed, jeans, her school sweatshirt, her sneakers tied, a glass of water she had poured and not drunk. The overhead light in the kitchen casting its flat illumination over the homework she had finished hours ago and not put away. She looked up when Sarah came through the door. Petra had a nightmare, Nadia said. Her voice was very controlled, the control of someone who has had several hours to decide how to say what they are about to say. Around 1, she woke up crying and you weren't here. I told her you had stepped out for air. She believed me. A pause. I don't know if I did. Sarah set her keys on the counter. I had to take care of something, she said. At 4 in the morning. It couldn't wait. Nadia looked at her mother, 12 years old, and the eyes of someone much older. Not cynical, not angry, but watchful in the way that comes from loving someone and watching them change into someone slightly different and not being able to stop it. You've been different since the basement, Nadia said, since whatever you found down there. You check the window locks before bed every single night. You take different routes to work. You jump when the phone rings. She blinked. Whatever this is, it's changing you. You're scaring me, Mom. The words went in like something precise and very cold. Sarah had kept this separate from her daughters, had maintained the separation with tremendous care and effort, the way a surgeon maintains a sterile field, because the alternative was unthinkable. But the sterile field had been breached, and the person who had breached it was standing in Sarah's kitchen at 4 in the morning, having stayed awake for hours to say something true. I'm trying to protect you, Sarah said. All of you, everything I've done. I know, Nadia said. She didn't say it dismissively. She said it the way she said things that she had thought through completely. I know you think that's what you were doing, but Mom. She stopped, started again. That's not how family works. We're supposed to protect each other, especially from the hard stuff. Another pause. Especially from each other. She went upstairs. Sarah stood in the kitchen alone for a long time after she heard Nadia's door close. The compass was cold against her chest. She put her hand over it. She took out Agent Harlow's card. She looked at the handwritten number on the back. She looked at the compass. Then she looked at the ceiling, at the room above it where Nadia was lying awake, where Petra and June were sleeping, where 3 people who needed their mother not to become a version of herself she couldn't come back from were trusting her to make the right decision. Whatever decision that turned out to be. She set the card on the table. She sat down. She did not sleep. When the first gray light of morning came through the kitchen window, Sarah picked up her phone. She dialed the number. It rang once. Mrs. Calloway. Harlow's voice was alert and unhurried, the voice of someone who had not been asleep, who had perhaps not been asleep for some time. I've been expecting your call. The morning was gray and still. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with both hands around her phone and listened to the silence on the line after Harlow's voice. Not the silence of disconnection, the other kind. The silence of someone waiting with complete patience because they already know how this ends. I need to think, Sarah said. You've had 4 months to think, Harlow said. Not unkindly, just accurately. I'll be at the field office in Hartford at 9. If you come in today, we talk. If you don't, we talk differently. And I make that call, not you. The line went dead. Sarah set the phone on the table. Outside, Birchwood Avenue was just beginning to emerge from the dark, the street light going off, the sky turning the particular gray that precedes February dawn, the shapes of houses resolving slowly from shadow into solid form. A neighbor's dog moved along the sidewalk on its morning circuit, nose down, trailing its owner 20 feet behind. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. She got up and made coffee. She drove to Daniel Beckett's shop at 7:30. Not because she needed him to make the decision. She had stopped expecting other people to make her decisions somewhere around the third week of sleeping in a car. She drove to his shop because she needed to say the truth out loud to one person before she said it to the federal government. And Daniel was the one person whose response she trusted to be honest rather than managed. The shop was a low building on the commercial end of Fulton Street. Plumbing and heating, the sign read, a bunch saying, with a phone number and the silhouette of a wrench. Daniel's truck was already in the lot. Through the window, she could see the light on in the back office. He looked up when she came in and said nothing, which was the right response. She sat down in the metal folding chair across from his desk. She looked at the surface between them, the invoices and pipe catalogs and the coffee mug with the Marine Corps emblem that had been washed so many times the emblem was more suggestion than image. I found gold in the basement, she said. A lot of it, hidden behind a section of wall that had been repointed sometime in the late 80s. 37 containers of raw gold that was stolen from a mining company transport in 1987 by the man who owned the house before the woman who left it to the city. She paused. I also found what was left of the security guard he killed to get it. Raymond Cole, 27 years old. He had a wife and a daughter. The shop was very quiet. A pipe fitting somewhere in the back made a soft metallic sound as the building warmed in the morning cold. I sent an anonymous tip to the FBI about the remains, Sarah continued. They came, they found Raymond Cole, they identified him. They closed the murder case. The gold, I moved it before they searched. I've been selling it piece by piece for 4 months. She stopped. I have 3 daughters who were sleeping in a parking lot. I want to be honest about why I did it, but I also want to be honest that I knew it was wrong. Daniel had not moved. He was looking at her with the same expression she had seen him use when he was assessing a structural problem. Not judgment, not emotion, just the clear-eyed attention of someone determining the actual dimensions of what they were dealing with. The FBI knows, Sarah said, or suspects enough that it amounts to the same thing. They want me to come in today. A long moment passed. What does your heart tell you to do? Daniel said. Sarah had expected several possible responses. This was not among them. She looked down at the compass on its chain around her neck. She had put her hand over it without noticing. That I'm tired, she said. Tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of lying to Nadia. Tired of becoming someone I don't recognize. She paused. That Raymond Cole was somebody's father, and he's been in a dirt basement for 37 years, and the least I can do is stop benefiting from why he's there. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Sounds like you've already decided, he said. I've decided, Sarah said. I'm scared of what comes next. He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. A brief, firm gesture, the kind that means I'm here without asking anything in return. Whatever happens, he said, I'll be here for the girls. For whatever you need. You don't face this part alone. Sarah nodded. She picked up her coffee cup and finished what was left in it, which had gone cold. Then she drove to Hartford. The FBI field office occupied the 4th and 5th floors of a building that looked from the outside like every other government building. Glass and concrete, American flag at the entrance, a lobby security desk staffed by a man who checked her ID with the mechanical thoroughness of someone who had done it 40,000 times. Agent Harlow met her at the elevator. Today she wore her badge on a lanyard and looked entirely different from the woman in the parking lot. More formal, more official, and somehow both more and less threatening for it. Thank you for coming in, Harlow said. I didn't have a great alternative, Sarah said. Harlow almost smiled. No, you didn't. The conference room was small and deliberately neutral. A table, chairs, a window with the blinds half open, a carafe of water nobody had touched. Agent Caldwell from the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Division was already seated when Sarah came in. He was a compact man in his 50s with silver hair and the precise, economical movements of someone who had spent decades being careful with every word he said. He introduced himself and opened a folder. "Mrs. Calloway," he began, "Agent Harlow has briefed me on the situation. I've reviewed the financial records we've compiled over the past several weeks." He looked at her directly. "I want to be straightforward with you about where we are. We have documentation of 17 cash deposits structured below the federal reporting threshold over a period of 4 months. We have a shell company registered in Delaware receiving payments for consulting services that you are not credentialed to provide. We have travel records placing you in 6 different cities, each corresponding with a transaction at a precious metals dealer within a 12-hour window." He let that sit for a moment. "We have enough to open a formal investigation that would be very public and very thorough," he said. "What we don't have yet is your cooperation." Sarah looked at the folder on the table between them. She thought about the morning she had sat on the kitchen floor and cried for 20 minutes and then picked up her pen. She thought about Nadia at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning. She thought about Raymond Cole's photograph in the newspaper. 27 years old, the whole future still apparently ahead of him. "I want full immunity," Sarah said, "in writing. For me. Protection for my daughters. In exchange, I'll return every ounce of gold I have left. I'll tell you exactly where it is and how I moved it. I'll document every transaction I've made, every buyer, every amount, every date." Caldwell and Harlow exchanged a look. "Immunity agreements require Justice Department approval," Caldwell said. "I can't give you a signed guarantee today. What I can give you is this." He produced a typed letter and slid it across the table. "A formal statement of our intent to recommend immunity to the U.S. Attorney's Office, contingent on your full and truthful cooperation. It's not a guarantee, but it's a significant statement of intent from people with significant influence over what happens next." Sarah read the document carefully. Every word, the careful legal language, recommend, contingent, subject to review. It was not everything she had hoped for. It was considerably more than she had feared. She picked up the pen. Her signature was steady. They took her to the storage unit first. Sarah in her own car, Harlow and Caldwell in an unmarked vehicle behind her. A third car she hadn't been introduced to following at a distance she noticed but pretended not to. She drove at exactly the speed limit. She used every turn signal. She kept both hands on the wheel. The storage facility was a low complex of corrugated metal buildings on the edge of an industrial park. The kind of place that existed in every mid-sized American city, anonymous by design, a geography of other people's secrets. Sarah's unit was in the second row. She unlocked the padlock with a key from her keychain and stepped back. Caldwell's professional composure held for approximately 3 seconds after the door rolled up. Then he let out a low sound, not quite a word, and stepped forward into the unit. What remained was still substantial. Sarah had moved perhaps 40% of the original find to the cabin. The containers she had accessed most frequently, the smaller, more portable pieces. What remained in the storage unit was the larger portion, the heavier containers, the ones she had not yet touched. They sat in 2 rows along the walls, green metal in the fluorescent light, orderly as they had been when she found them. Harlow began photographing. The Treasury forensic accountant, who had been in the third car, started an inventory with the focused efficiency of someone who had cataloged seized assets before and found the process deeply satisfying. Caldwell turned to Sarah. "How much have you already sold?" "Approximately 40% of the original quantity," Sarah said. "I didn't keep precise records of the gold itself, but I can document every cash transaction on the other end. Dates, amounts, locations, descriptions of the buyers." "And the rest of the gold?" "You mentioned a property." "A cabin," Sarah said, 49 miles north. I'll give you the address and the keys." She reached into her coat pocket and produced both. "I drove there before I came in today. What's there is what I left there." Caldwell looked at the keys in his hand for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, but the recognition of a person who has done something difficult and done it completely. For someone with no criminal background, he said quietly, you constructed a remarkably sophisticated operation. Most people in your situation make critical mistakes within the first few weeks. Sarah looked at him steadily. I had 3 daughters who needed their mother not to fail, she said. That tends to focus the mind. They were there for 5 hours. By the time Harlow walked Sarah back to her car in the late afternoon, the storage unit had been sealed with evidence tape and arrangements made for secure transport. The cabin address had been relayed to a second team. The forensic accountant had enough preliminary documentation to begin the financial reconstruction that would take, Caldwell estimated, several weeks of detailed work. What happens now? Sarah asked. You go home, Harlow said. You cooperate fully with every request for documentation and information. You answer every question truthfully and completely. You don't move anything, sell anything, or make any financial transactions beyond ordinary household expenses without notifying me first. She paused. And then you wait. How long? Weeks, maybe longer. Federal processes don't have a reputation for speed. Harlow looked at her for a moment. You did the right thing today, Mrs. Calloway. I did the right thing 4 months late, Sarah said. Yes, Harlow said, but you did it. She started toward her own car, then stopped and turned back. The gold goes back to Cascade Mining. They're the rightful owner, still in business, different management, but the same company. There's a formal claims process. She paused as if deciding something. You should look into their asset recovery policy before that process concludes. I'd recommend it. She offered nothing more. She got in her car and drove away. Sarah stood alone in the parking lot of the storage facility as the afternoon light went flat and gray. She put her hand over the compass. Then she drove home to her daughters. The debriefing sessions with Harlow and Caldwell ran for 3 weeks, every morning except weekends, in a conference room at the Hartford field office that Sarah came to know with the familiarity of a place you spend significant portions of your life. She answered every question. All of them. The dates, the amounts, the names of dealers, the routes she had driven, the accounts she had opened, the construction of the shell company, the cabin purchase, the techniques she had used to age the repointed mortar, so the FBI wouldn't see which section had been disturbed. That last detail produced the only moment of genuine surprise she observed in Caldwell's professional face across those 3 weeks. You researched historic masonry restoration techniques specifically to deceive a federal evidence search, he said. YouTube, Sarah said. There are very good tutorials. On the 14th day, toward the end of the session, Sarah asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since January. The letter, she said, the one with the newspaper clipping. I know what you found. That was you. Caldwell looked up from his folder. He and Harlow exchanged a brief glance. It was a calculated risk, Caldwell said. We needed to assess your response, whether you'd run, dispose of assets quickly, or sit still. He set down his pen. You sat still, and then you called. Sarah absorbed this for a moment. She had suspected Harlow. She had suspected Earl Watkins. She had even, in her worst and most paranoid moments, suspected Daniel. She had built entire contingency plans around the possibility that any one of them was the source. It had been the FBI the whole time, rattling the cage to see what moved. Did it work the way you expected? She asked. Caldwell looked at her steadily. You're here, he said simply, and went back to his folder. On the 21st day, Caldwell set a different kind of document on the table between them, the immunity agreement, signed by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Connecticut, countersigned by Caldwell's supervisor at Treasury, witnessed by Harlow. The language was precise and thorough and left fewer gaps than Sarah had feared. She read it 3 times. Then she signed it. On the way out of the building that afternoon, she stopped in the lobby restroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrist for a long time. Not because anything hurt, because she needed to feel something concrete and physical in the moment of understanding that a certain version of her life had just officially ended, and that the ending, however frightening, was also something else. A clearing, a field after a long winter, stripped of everything that had grown wrong in it, ready for something new to take root. The call from Margaret Byrne came on a Thursday afternoon. Sarah had expected the CEO of Cascade Mining to be someone she would immediately dislike. The automatic wariness of a person who has spent years at the economic mercy of institutions and the people who run them. Margaret Byrne was not that person. She was a woman in her mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of direct manner that Sarah associated with people who had earned authority through actually knowing what they were talking about rather than inheriting it. She had flown in from Denver for the meeting. She sat across from Sarah in a conference room she had borrowed from the Hartford field office and looked at her with an attention that felt less like assessment than genuine interest. "I wanted to meet you myself," Byrne said. "Not through intermediaries, not through lawyers." She paused. "I've been following the recovery process carefully. Agent Caldwell tells me your cooperation has been complete." "I told them everything," Sarah said. "There wasn't a point at which I considered not telling them everything." "No," Byrne said. "I don't imagine there was by the time you walked in." She looked at her hands for a moment. "Mrs. Calloway, our company has a finder's fee policy for recovered assets. Standard in the industry, 20% of the recovered value. Given the current gold price and the quantity recovered, that figure is approximately $10.4 million. Sarah said nothing. The number sat in the air between them like an object that had been set down too heavily. "That's fully documented income," Byrne continued. "Taxable. Legal in every way. Our legal department will process the paperwork through the standard claims procedure, which should conclude within 60 to 90 days of the formal case closing." "Why say?" Sarah said. The word came out flat and direct, the way words come when you don't have the energy left for anything more diplomatic. "I kept the gold for 4 months. I sold nearly half of it. I created shell companies to hide the money. Why would you pay me anything?" Byrne was quiet for a moment. "Raymond Cole was my late husband's closest friend," she said. "They grew up together in the same neighborhood in Colorado. When Raymond disappeared in 1987, my husband spent 2 years trying to keep the investigation alive before the trail went completely cold. He called the FBI field office in Denver every month for 18 months. He hired a private investigator with money we couldn't afford. He died in 2019, still not knowing what had happened to the person he considered a brother." She looked at Sarah directly. "Diane Cole, Raymond's daughter, is my goddaughter. I've watched her carry the absence of her father her entire life. The not knowing, the impossibility of a grave to visit, a date to mark, a story with an ending." She paused. "You gave them that. Whatever you did before you gave them that, you gave them that." Sarah looked at the table. "The finder's fee is legitimate corporate policy," Byrne said. "I won't pretend my personal connection is irrelevant to my decision to apply it in your case. But I'd apply it regardless. 37 years is a long time to wait for answers. The company owes a debt that money can't fully pay. But $10 million is what the policy provides, and you'll receive it." She stood and smoothed her jacket. "Use it well," she said simply. "For your daughters." The phone rang on a Sunday evening. Area code 602, Arizona. Sarah almost let it go to voicemail. She had been letting most calls go to voicemail for weeks, conditioned by months of fearing what calls might contain. But something made her answer. "Mrs. Calloway." A woman's voice, careful and measured, with the particular quality of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say and is now departing from the script because the rehearsal no longer covers what they actually feel. "My name is Diane Cole. Raymond Cole was my father. Margaret Byrne gave me your number. I hope that's all right." Sarah sat down on the edge of her bed. "Of course," she said. "I'm glad you called." There was a pause. On the other end, Sarah could hear the faint sound of a television in another room, the small ambient sounds of an ordinary house, someone living an ordinary life that had been shaped in its foundations by an absence she had never been able to explain or accept. "I've been thinking for weeks about what to say to you," Diane said. "I had a speech prepared. A reasonable, adult speech about grief and closure and the complexity of how I feel about the whole situation." Another pause. "I don't think I'm going to give that speech." "That's all right," Sarah said. "My mother spent 20 years insisting that my father didn't leave, that something had happened to him. People were kind to her about it and quietly assumed she was in denial, the way people do when the alternative is too painful to accept." Diane's voice was steady, but with the steadiness of a controlled effort. She was right. She was right the whole time, and she died 4 years ago, still not knowing for certain. Sarah said nothing. There was nothing useful she could say. "My father spent the last hours of his life in handcuffs," Diane said, "in a basement, Alone. That's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. I want to be honest with you about that. A breath. But because of you, he has a grave now. He has a date and a place and his name on a stone. My children, his grandchildren he never met, will know where to go when they want to be near him. That's not nothing, Mrs. Calloway. That's everything. Sarah realized her face was wet. She hadn't noticed when it started. You could have left him there forever, Diane said. The bones in the wall of a house that sold for $1. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have looked. A pause. You didn't do that? I sent the letter the week after I found him, Sarah said. That part I did right away. I know, Diane said. Agent Harlow told me. Another silence. I'd like to meet you, Mrs. Calloway, if you'd be willing. When they formally close my father's case, I'd like to sit across from you. I'd like that too, Sarah said. After she hung up, she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time in the quiet house. Downstairs, she could hear June practicing something on the recorder she had borrowed from the school's music program. The notes slow and careful and occasionally wrong, in the way of someone learning something genuinely new. From further away, the sound of Petra working through a problem said aloud, the murmured rhythm of a mind doing mathematics in the particular language that was entirely her own. Sarah pressed her palm against her chest, against the compass. This was the thing she had been protecting. This specific sound in this specific house, on this street where the lights were on, in the houses that had been dark when she first walked down it 4 months ago, with $78 and a piece of newspaper. She had come very close to losing it, not just to the FBI, to herself, to what she had been slowly becoming in the months of secrecy and calculation and managed distance from the people who needed her to be fully present. She had been so focused on the architecture of survival that she had nearly forgotten what she was building it for. She went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and waited for her daughters to come find her. 3 weeks later, Agent Harlow asked to meet at the Millbrook Public Library, not the field office, the library. Sarah arrived to find Harlow in the back study room, out of uniform, in a gray sweater and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked younger. She looked like someone who had decided for one meeting to be a person rather than a federal agent. She had a tablet open to a document full of statistics. I've been doing some research, Harlow said, in my personal time, not bureau business. She turned the tablet so Sarah could see. Millbrook County has one of the highest rates of vacant and abandoned residential properties in the state. 114 properties currently in tax default, structurally sound enough for habitation with appropriate renovation. Meanwhile, the county has 843 families on the emergency housing wait list. Sarah looked at the numbers. A foundation, Harlow said, structured properly, a nonprofit with a board, financial transparency, documented selection criteria. You purchase abandoned properties, renovate them to a minimum habitability standard, and transfer title to qualified families for a nominal consideration. She paused. $1, for instance. Sarah looked up from the tablet. The finder's fee provides the seed capital, Harlow continued. Cascade mining might contribute to the operating cost. Margaret Byrne mentioned something along those lines to Caldwell. The model can be self-sustaining if a small percentage of equity appreciation cycles back into the foundation when families eventually sell. She closed the tablet. You know how to buy a broken house and make it livable. You know what a family in crisis needs that the system isn't providing, and you're about to have resources. She said it quietly and without drama. Then she put her glasses back on and gathered her things. I'll be transferring to the Community Liaison Office at the Bureau's New Haven branch when this case formally closes, she said. If someone were to establish a housing foundation in this part of the state, a liaison relationship with the Bureau might facilitate the kinds of financial transparency that make foundations trustworthy to donors. She picked up her bag. Just a thought. She left Sarah alone in the study room with the afternoon light coming through the narrow window. Sarah sat there for a long time. Then she drove home and told her daughters. She told them at the kitchen table, the way she had come to understand that important things needed to be said. At the table with the lights on, with nothing between them. She told them about the gold and what she had done and what she had decided. Not a managed version, not a version filtered for age appropriateness. The actual version. with the actual weight of the choices she had made and the choices she was making now, because she had learned the hard way that the version you manage to protect your children is also the version that separates you from them, and she had had enough of separation. Nadia listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, she asked 3 questions in quick succession about the legal structure of a nonprofit, about the criteria for selecting recipient families, about how the equity recycling mechanism would work in practice. Each question was better than the one before it. Sarah answered the ones she knew the answers to and said, "I don't know yet," to the ones she didn't. And Nadia wrote both kinds of answers down. Petra got a piece of paper and started doing arithmetic before Sarah had finished explaining the model. By the time the conversation moved forward, she had produced a rough projection of how many properties the foundation could renovate in the first 2 years at 3 different funding levels, with margin notes about variables that could shift the numbers in either direction. June was quiet for a long moment after everyone else had spoken. She was looking at something in the middle distance, the way she looked when she was constructing something in her mind before putting it on paper. "Can the kids of the new families come help paint?" she said, "like we did when we fixed our house." "Yes," Sarah said. "I think that's actually a very good idea." Another silence. Then June said, "I want to draw the logo. It should be a house with a heart on the door and a key, and the key should say $1. "I think that's perfect," Sarah said. Nadia had been quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then she looked up. "The foundation should have a name," she said. "Something that means something." She paused. "Raymond Cole. It should be the Raymond Cole Foundation. He's the reason any of this exists. He should be part of what it becomes." Nobody disagreed. Phoenix was warm in a way that February in Connecticut was not, and stepping off the plane felt like stepping into a different season entirely, which Sarah supposed it was. Diane Cole met her at a restaurant near her neighborhood. She was in her early 40s, with her father's eyes from the photograph, direct and warm and unafraid. Her husband, an architect named Thomas who specialized in affordable housing design, came with her and said relatively little but listened to everything with the careful attention of someone building a mental model of what he was hearing, turning it over, finding its structural properties. Margaret Byrne joined them midway through the lunch. She sat at the corner of the table and said less than anyone expected and absorbed more than anyone realized, which was Sarah was beginning to understand simply how Margaret Byrne moved through most situations. Sarah laid out the foundation concept, the structure, the model, the name. She talked about Nadia's questions and Petra's projections and June's logo design. She talked about Harlow's research and the numbers from Millbrook County and the 114 vacant properties with solid foundations waiting for someone to pay attention to them. Diane Cole listened with the expression of someone who had spent 37 years waiting for a story to have an ending and was discovering in real time that it had something else instead, not an ending, but a continuation into territory she had never imagined. When Sarah finished, Diane looked at her husband. Something passed between them that didn't need words. "Thomas has been looking for a project that could serve as a replicable model," Diane said. "Something that could be documented, studied, and adapted to other communities. He's worked in affordable housing design for 15 years, and he's never found the right anchor project." She paused. "I think he just did." Thomas nodded once, confirming. "And I manage a community development fund," Diane continued. "We work with banks on distressed property acquisition. We have relationships you'd spend years building from scratch. Title companies, municipal housing offices, community development financial institutions. We can bring that infrastructure to the Raymond Cole Foundation from day one." Margaret Byrne set her coffee cup down with the deliberateness of someone making a formal statement through a physical gesture. "Cascade Mining has a community investment program that has been looking for a significant regional initiative," she said, "something with a genuine story behind it, something that connects the company's history to something constructive going forward." She looked at Sarah directly. "The Raymond Cole Foundation would be that, if you'd allow the company to be involved." Sarah looked around the table. Harlow had said, "What if the finder's fee built something that actually mattered?" She had meant it as a question. Sitting in a restaurant in Phoenix with the people who were answering it, Sarah understood that it had always been more than a question. It had been a forecast, offered quietly by someone who had been watching what Sarah was made of for months and had drawn her own conclusions. "Raymond would have liked this," Diane said quietly. She was looking at her water glass, But her voice was somewhere else entirely, somewhere 37 years back, in a life that had been interrupted before it could become what it was supposed to be. He always said his job was protecting what mattered. A pause. And what matters more than giving families a safe place to come home to? 5 years passed. They passed the way years pass when you are doing work that is genuinely hard and genuinely necessary. Not quickly, not easily, but with the particular satisfaction of watching something grow from nothing into something that exists independently of your daily attention to it. Something that would continue without you, if it had to. Something built on a foundation solid enough to outlast its builders. The Raymond Cole Foundation transferred title on 112 properties in those 5 years, across 7 counties and 3 states. Nadia came home for the summers and worked harder than the paid staff, bringing her mother's practicality and something her mother was still learning: the ability to ask for help without treating it as a defeat. Petra, now 15, ran the foundation's financial projections with a sophistication that made the outside accounting firm look at her numbers and then look at her and recalibrate everything they thought they understood about what a 15-year-old could do with a spreadsheet. June showed up at every single property transfer with handmade cards and cookies she had baked herself, sitting with the children of incoming families while their parents navigated the paperwork, telling them about the house she had moved into when she was 7 years old, the leaking roof and the camping lantern and the pioneers, and how the broken thing had become the most beautiful place she knew. June's logo, the house with the heart-shaped door and the key marked with a small numeral 1, was laser-cut in brass at the entrance of the foundation's Millbrook office and reproduced in a New York Times feature on innovative housing models that generated more donor inquiries in a single week than the foundation's first full year of fundraising combined. The house on Birchwood Avenue was the thing that stayed the same while everything else changed. Daniel had transformed the basement over the course of 6 months into a proper workshop. Bright, ventilated, tools arranged on pegboard with the same organized intentionality he brought to everything. He taught carpentry to neighborhood kids on Saturday mornings, and the workshop had accumulated the particular warmth of a place where people came regularly and learned things and left better equipped for the world than they had arrived. The Saturday chairs were never quite put back in their right positions. Daniel had stopped trying to make them be. The spot where the wall had been, where the stones had been repointed and the room had been sealed and Raymond Cole had spent 37 years in the dark, was now a workbench. A solid thing, built from reclaimed lumber, used every week for purposes that made the space it occupied mean something better than what it had meant before. Sarah and Daniel were married in the backyard on an afternoon in early October, 5 years and 1 week after the date on the eviction notice that Sarah had folded and unfolded until the creases went soft. 3 daughters in dresses they had each selected with strong and completely irreconcilable opinions that somehow in the end worked together beautifully. Earl Watkins in the front row, with his cane and his good coat, in the particular expression of a man who has watched something he quietly hoped for come to pass, and is too dignified to say "I told you so," but is thinking it with considerable satisfaction. On a Wednesday evening in late autumn, Sarah stood in the doorway of the basement workshop and watched Daniel sand the face of a cabinet door for a kitchen renovation across town. The light was warm, the smell was sawdust and linseed oil. From upstairs came the sound of dinner being assembled. Petra's voice and June's voice in the particular overlapping register of sisters who argue about everything and agree about the things that matter most without ever saying so directly. "Thinking about old times," Daniel said, without looking up from the sanding. "Thinking about Raymond Cole," Sarah said. She came in and leaned against the doorframe. "About how a man I never met spent 37 years in this room so that eventually, somehow, 112 families could have a place to come home to." Daniel set down the sanding block and looked at her. "You think he'd consider that a fair trade?" he said. "No," Sarah said. "I don't think any trade is fair against a life." She looked around the workshop, the tools on their hooks, the projects in various stages of completion, the Saturday morning chairs pulled out at irregular angles from the morning's lesson. "But I think there's a difference between a death that means nothing and a death that becomes the foundation of something. And I hope his family feels that difference." Daniel picked up the sanding block again. "She called last week," Sarah said. "Diane. She's bringing her kids to Millbrook in the spring. Wants them to see the house, the workshop. She paused. The foundation office. Good, Daniel said. She said she wants her kids to understand that their grandfather is part of why all of this exists. Sarah was quiet for a moment. That he's still protecting something. The workshop was warm. The sanding resumed its steady, patient rhythm. Upstairs, June called that dinner was ready, in a voice that suggested she had called once already and was fully prepared to escalate, which was her general approach to situations requiring other people's attention, and which had served her remarkably well in her role as the Foundation's official family greeter. Sarah pushed herself off the doorframe. She paused at the stairs and put her hand over the compass, the way she had come to do when she was leaving one thing and going toward another. The needle was steady. It was always steady now, not because the path had become straight, but because she had learned that knowing where north was didn't require a straight path. It only required that you know always where the direction was, so that when you needed it, when the night was darkest and the choices were hardest, and the right thing and the easy thing had separated so far you could barely see one from the other, you could find your way back. She climbed the stairs toward the warm light and the sound of her family. That night after dinner, June asked if she could say grace. It was not something they did regularly, but June asked with the particular seriousness of someone who has been thinking about a thing for a while and has decided the time has come. And so everyone at the table joined hands without question. Daniel's large, steady hand on one side, Nadia's careful, deliberate hand on the other, Petra across the table with her chin down in the way she had when she was concentrating, and June at the end with her eyes already closed. June bowed her head. "Thank you for our house," she said. "That was broken and became beautiful." Her voice was clear and unhurried, the voice of a 12-year-old who has learned that some things deserve to be said carefully and without rushing. "Thank you for the scary things that turned into good things. Thank you for Daddy Daniel. And thank you for Mommy being brave enough to do the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing she'd ever done." A pause. Outside on Birchwood Avenue, the houses that had been dark when Sarah first walked down the street on an October afternoon with $78 and a folded piece of newspaper were lit from within. The particular warm light of houses where people were eating dinner, where children were doing homework, where the ordinary, irreplaceable business of living was being conducted by families who had somewhere to do it. "And thank you," June said, "for all the other families who get to say something like this tonight, in their own dollar houses." Everyone at the table said amen. Sarah kept her eyes closed for a moment after the others had opened theirs. She held Nadia's hand on one side and Daniel's on the other, and felt the specific, unrepeatable weight of where she was. This table, this room, this house that had cost $1 and everything she had, and turned out to be worth more than she knew how to calculate. The compass was warm against her chest. Some treasure, she had learned, came with terrible prices. Prices that left marks. Prices you carried for a long time in the places that didn't show. In the small hours and the quiet moments, in the dreams that still, sometimes, returned her to a cold basement, in a phone light, in a pair of rusted handcuffs still closed around a wrist. But some treasure, if you were brave enough to let go of what you'd taken, honest enough to face what you'd done, and stubborn enough to build something worthy of the cost, brought you all the way home.